3 true scary stories from haunted hospitals. Ghostly encounters that will haunt you. The night had settled over the old St. Barnabas Hospital, and with it came an unsettling silence that seemed to seep from the very walls. The building, with its crumbling exterior and faded brickwork, stood as a relic of a bygone era. Once a place of healing, it had long since given way to whispers, rumors that it was haunted by the ghosts of the past. The local townsfolk avoided it like the plague, crossing the street whenever they passed by, their eyes darting nervously toward its dark windows. No one could quite explain it, but the stories never stopped. Old nurses, retired doctors, and janitors, all who had worked within these walls, spoke in hushed tones about the strange happenings that plagued the hospital. Some claimed to hear screams in the dead of night, voices carried through the halls by the wind, yet there were no bodies to claim them. Others swore they'd seen flickers of shadowy figures at the edge of their vision. Doctors who looked far too familiar, patients who never left. The air itself seemed thick with sorrow, charged with the unshakable feeling that the building was far from empty. It had become a place where the past lingered, unwilling to rest. In the emergency department, the smell of antiseptic mixed with the more lingering, unsettling scent of decay. Though the hospital had been recently renovated, a sense of rot seemed to have seeped deep into its foundation. The old equipment sat in corners like forgotten relics, gathering dust as if the place itself was slowly retreating from time. It was as if the hospital was waiting, holding its breath, preparing for something. And it was on this grim stage that Dr. Alex Porter stepped into his new role. Fresh out of medical school, eager to prove himself, Dr. Porter was confident, perhaps a bit too confident. He had heard the rumors about St. Barnabas, of course, but he had dismissed them as nothing more than urban legends, nothing but stories spun to pass the time or frighten children. The supernatural? He had no room for it in his world. Medicine was his calling, science was his language, and he believed in what could be seen, measured, and understood. But even the most rational minds have their limits. Dr. Porter was assigned to the hospital's emergency department, a bustling, hectic place that never seemed to sleep. He arrived on his first day, a little nervous, but ready to dive into the work that would define his career. The shift was long, but it was nothing he couldn't handle. He had seen trauma before. He had prepared for it. What he hadn't prepared for were the odd occurrences that began creeping into his shift. The flickering lights, the sudden chill in the air, the disembodied whispers that seemed to follow him through the sterile corridors. At first, he thought nothing of it. Perhaps it was the stress of starting a new job or the exhaustion from a long day. But then it happened again and again, little things that gnawed at the edges of his rationality, things he couldn't explain, but things that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. It was as if the hospital itself was alive, watching, waiting, and perhaps even remembering. The worst part, though, was the feeling that never seemed to leave him. It was as if something had shifted, like the hospital itself had awoken from a long slumber, and now it was aware of his presence. As if the very walls, the floors, the air, had somehow become sentient, burdened with a history so thick it could not be ignored. Dr. Porter had always considered himself a skeptic, a man of reason. But in the pit of his stomach, something began to stir, an unease he couldn't quite shake. There was something wrong with St. Barnabas, something that couldn't be explained away with science, and certainly something that wouldn't be solved by medical knowledge alone. Something deeper, something darker. It wasn't long before Dr. Porter realized that the hospital wasn't just haunted by memories. It was haunted by the souls of those who had never left. And the more he delved into the hospital's history, the more he learned about the spirits, some restless, others vengeful, that lingered in its decaying halls. He could only wonder, was he too becoming a part of that story? Or was he simply caught in the web spun by the past? A past that refused to let go. St. Barnabas had its secrets, and now so did Dr. Porter. Story 1. Screaming Spirits of Past Patients. The sterile glow of fluorescent lights flickered overhead as Dr. Alex Porter adjusted the collar of his white coat, trying to mask the unease that had slowly crept into his chest. The night shift at St. Barnabas Hospital was in full swing, and the emergency department was a blur of activity. But there was something about the stillness of the late hours that felt unnerving, a quiet that felt unnatural, as though the hospital itself was holding its breath. Dr. Porter had worked the day shift without issue. The patients had been routine, the cases manageable. But now, with the world outside plunged into darkness, the hospital felt different. It was no longer a bustling medical facility, but something older, something forgotten. The old building groaned under the weight of its age, its hallways stretching out like veins filled with the memories of long-forgotten tragedies. He'd heard the rumors about Room 34, the so-called death room, before he'd even set foot in the hospital. The stories were always the same. Strange noises, inexplicable events, and the feeling that the room itself was alive with suffering. Most staff members refused to work near it. Some even swore that the room had a cursed history, its walls soaked with the pain of patients who had died under mysterious circumstances. But Dr. Porter was a skeptic, grounded in the logic of science and reason. He didn't believe in ghosts or curses. That was for the superstitious, the weak-minded. That was until the first night shift. The hospital had fallen into a deep, unsettling quiet by the time Dr. Porter made his rounds through the eerily empty halls. The usual hustle and bustle of the day had dissipated, leaving only the distant clatter of nurses' shoes echoing in the hallway and the soft hum of machinery. Dr. Porter passed Room 34, its door ajar, casting a faint shadow onto the floor. As he walked by, something stopped him in his tracks. A sound, faint at first, but unmistakable. A scream. It was a high-pitched, agonizing cry, one filled with pure, unadulterated pain. It echoed through the hallway, curling its way into his ears and rattling him to his core. Dr. Porter froze, his heart hammering in his chest. The sound was unmistakable, the voice of someone in the throes of their final moments, the kind of scream he had heard only in the worst of horror films. But this wasn't a movie. This was real. He turned toward Room 34, his feet hesitant, as if they too had doubts about what they might find inside. The door was still open, and the scream came again, louder this time, more desperate. The kind of scream that had no place in this world, the kind of scream that made his blood run cold. Probably just the pipes, he muttered to himself, trying to steady his breath. The building was old, after all. Old pipes creaked, old walls settled. The hospital had its quirks, but something about the scream sent a chill through him that went beyond the mere sounds of old plumbing. He walked toward the room, his hand hovering over the doorknob. For a moment, he hesitated. Should he investigate? Was this just his mind playing tricks on him? The first signs of exhaustion creeping in after a long shift? But the scream came again, louder, clearer this time, as if the walls themselves were shaking with the anguish of the sound. He could hear it now, distinct voices, voices that didn't belong to any patient he'd treated. There were whispers mixed in with the screams, fragmented words that seemed to be pleading, begging for something, for mercy. And the smell, there was something in the air, a scent of decay, of death. He opened the door. Room 34 was as empty as it had always been. Furniture covered in dust sheets, medical equipment that had long since been deemed obsolete. But the air inside was thick, heavy, as though something had been trapped within those walls for years. The windows were cracked open, allowing the chill of the night to creep in, but it was the sound that filled the room now. The scream had stopped, but the whispers remained, soft and insistent. Dr. Porter felt a shiver crawl up his spine. He stepped further into the room, his footsteps hesitant on the cold tile floor. The whispers seemed to be coming from the far corner, where a small cot sat, its sheets neatly folded. There was nothing there, no patient, no ghost, just silence. Nothing, he said aloud, shaking his head. I'm just tired. I'm hearing things. But the air felt thick with an energy he couldn't explain, and the walls seemed to pulse with the remnants of a history that hadn't quite finished telling its story. He left the room quickly, his heart still racing. But as he walked away, the scream came once more, piercing the silence, cutting through him like a knife. It was louder now, the voice clearer, an unmistakable cry for help. Dr. Porter's mind raced as he tried to make sense of it. His logical mind told him that it was impossible. There were no patients here at this hour. Room 34 had been abandoned for years. But the sounds didn't lie. As the night wore on, the screams returned, each one more painful than the last. And with each scream, Dr. Porter's grip on his rationality began to slip. What was real? What was just his imagination? What could he trust when the walls themselves seemed to betray him, filled with the echoes of suffering long past? The hours dragged on, and with each passing moment, Dr. Porter began to question his own sanity. Was he hearing ghosts? Was he being manipulated by the hospital's eerie past? Or was he simply losing his grip on reality? The more he thought about it, the more the whispers seemed to infiltrate his thoughts, tugging at the edges of his mind, pushing him toward the brink of madness. By the time his shift ended, Dr. Porter was no longer certain of anything. He had come to this hospital as a man of science, a skeptic, a rationalist. But in the shadow of room 34, he had glimpsed something that defied explanation, something that could not be reasoned away. As he left the hospital, the echoes of the screams still ringing in his ears, he couldn't help but wonder, was it the hospital's past that was haunting him? Or was it something much darker, something that had found its way into the very fabric of the hospital itself? Something that was not yet finished, not yet ready to let go. And as he drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that room 34 had not finished with him either. The days following Dr. Porter's first terrifying night in room 34 were a blur of disbelief and growing unease. The relentless screaming he had heard seemed to reverberate through his every thought, an incessant reminder of the unsettling experience. His rational mind, once steadfast and grounded, began to unravel. No matter how he tried to convince himself, it was just the workings of his tired mind, an overreaction to an old building's creaks and groans. Something within him told him that this was no mere coincidence. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened in room 34, something dark and lingering that refused to be forgotten. The hospital staff had noticed Dr. Porter's growing distress. Nurses exchanged furtive glances when he passed by, and some of the older doctors gave him knowing looks. They had seen the new doctor's skepticism crumble into uncertainty. Most of them didn't speak of the old, abandoned room, but the few who did spoke in hushed tones, as though fearing the walls might overhear. In the midst of his frustration, Dr. Porter sought out someone who might know more about the hospital's history, someone who had been around long enough to witness the stories that had become nothing more than whispered legends. The old janitor, Mr. Walker, had been working at St. Barnabas for decades and was one of the few staff members who had been there long enough to remember the hospital's darker days. Mr. Walker's office, tucked in a forgotten corner of the hospital's maintenance area, smelled of dust and the stale remnants of cleaning supplies. When Dr. Porter approached the old man, he found him hunched over a stack of old hospital records, scribbling notes by the dim light of a single bulb. "Mr. Walker," Dr. Porter began, his voice tentative but determined, "I need to know about room 34. There's something I can't explain. The sounds, the whispers, the screams. People say it's haunted. What happened there?" The janitor's wrinkled face remained impassive for a long moment, and for a second, Dr. Porter thought the old man wouldn't answer. But then, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years, Mr. Walker slowly put down his pen and looked at Dr. Porter, his tired eyes filled with an ancient sadness. That room's been a curse for as long as I can remember," Mr. Walker said in a gravelly voice. "Many years ago, it wasn't always like that. It was just a regular room. But there was a dark time, when this hospital was overcrowded. There were too many patients, not enough doctors, and not enough care. Room 34 was where they put the ones who were too far gone to save. Too many of them died there, and not in peaceful ways. Some of them were left to suffer, neglected and alone, because the staff didn't have the time or resources to help them. And those screams, they still echo in these walls." Dr. Porter listened intently, a cold shiver running down his spine as the janitor's words sank in. He had heard of overcrowded hospitals and strained resources, but hearing the details, the neglect, the suffering, made it feel real, like something tangible. He couldn't help but feel a wave of guilt for being so dismissive of the rumors earlier. "Do you mean to say that these these people are still here?" Dr. Porter asked, his voice barely a whisper. "They never left," Mr. Walker replied softly, his eyes turning to the old records in front of him. "Some spirits don't rest easy when they've been wronged. They stay, lost, angry, yearning for something. They want justice or peace." Dr. Porter stood frozen, digesting the implications of what he had just learned. Spirits, restless souls bound to the hospital by unresolved trauma. He had always been a man of science, a man who believed in evidence, in things he could see and touch. But this was something else entirely, something beyond his understanding. The next night, Dr. Porter found himself back in the emergency department, the oppressive weight of the hospital bearing down on him. The familiar hum of machinery seemed quieter now, almost suffocating. The memories of his previous night's ordeal were fresh in his mind, and despite his attempts to put them behind him, the unease lingered like a shadow. He couldn't ignore the truth any longer. Room 34 called to him. He had to confront it head on. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight as Dr. Porter made his way through the darkened halls. This time he didn't hesitate. He pushed open the door to room 34, his breath shallow and quick. The room was exactly as he had left it, empty, abandoned, cold. But this time, something was different. The air was thick with the same oppressive energy, and as soon as he stepped inside, the whispers returned. Faint at first, but growing louder with each step. The sound seemed to slither along the walls, curling around him, filling his ears with words he couldn't quite make out. Then, the temperature dropped. A figure appeared before him, translucent at first, then gradually becoming clearer. A woman dressed in a blood-stained hospital gown, her hair matted to her forehead as if she had been through unimaginable suffering. Her eyes were wide with terror, her mouth frozen in a silent scream. Dr. Porter's heart slammed against his chest. The woman reached toward him, her fingers outstretched as though begging for something he couldn't understand. The vision was so vivid, so real, that he stumbled backward, his mind reeling. He felt a coldness seep into his bones, a chill that went beyond the temperature of the room. The woman's ghostly form flickered, her eyes pleading for release from the agony she had endured in life. "Please," she whispered, her voice soft but urgent. "Help me." The room seemed to pulse with an energy that was almost alive, the walls closing in on him. The air was thick with the weight of the past, with the anger and the suffering that had never been addressed. Dr. Porter was no longer sure if he was awake or dreaming, if the ghost before him was real or simply a manifestation of his growing fear. But one thing was certain: this was no figment of his imagination. This woman, this tortured soul, was real. He took a step toward her, his heart pounding. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice trembling. The woman's form shimmered, and for a brief moment, he saw the flash of pain in her eyes. Same pain that had once consumed her in life. It was the agony of neglect, of injustice, of an untimely death. Her spirit was trapped, unable to move on, bound to the room where she had suffered. Dr. Porter reached out, his hand shaking. He knew what he had to do. This wasn't about science. It wasn't about logic. It was about empathy, about giving the spirit the peace it had been denied for so long. He spoke softly, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm here. I hear you. I'll help you find peace." For a long, tense moment, nothing happened. The woman's eyes never left him, but the room had fallen silent, as if holding its breath. Then, slowly, the figure began to fade, her form dissolving into the cold air like mist. The temperature began to rise, and the whispers that had haunted him so persistently grew softer, then disappeared altogether. Dr. Porter stood alone in the room, his heart still racing, but the weight of the haunting presence had lifted. The screams, the whispers, the anguish, everything had gone silent. But as he left room 34, something inside him had changed. He no longer saw the hospital in the same way. The walls, once just a backdrop to his medical practice, now felt alive with the echoes of the past. The ghosts of trauma and suffering weren't just stories. They were real, bound to the places where they had been wronged. Dr. Porter had come to the hospital seeking answers, But what he found was something far more profound. Some spirits, he realized, weren't simply haunting a place. They were tethered to it by something deeper, something unresolved. And no matter how hard he tried to reason away the supernatural, he could no longer deny the truth. Some ghosts were not just memories. They were scars on the fabric of time itself. The whispers of room 34 faded, but Dr. Porter could still hear them in his mind, a reminder that some stories, no matter how old, are never truly over. Story 2. Ghostly Apparitions of Doctors. Dr. Alex Porter had only been working at St. Barnabas for a few weeks, but in that short time, he had seen enough strange occurrences to make him question his sanity. The whispers of room 34, the haunting screams that never seemed to end, those things had shaken him. But it was the figure that began to appear in the hospital's hallways that truly unsettled him. It started subtly. He would catch glimpses of an older man in a white coat, moving through the hospital late at night. At first, it was nothing more than a flash. A figure crossing a hallway just as he turned a corner, a brief silhouette in the periphery of his vision. But as days passed, the appearances grew more frequent. The man seemed to be everywhere. He was always present during Dr. Porter's late-night rounds, offering assistance to the nurses and doctors with tasks that seemed too insignificant for a senior physician. The figure was always in the background, never speaking unless spoken to, his presence more a shadow than a participant in the day-to-day bustle of the hospital. The man had a kind, weathered face, his white hair a bit thin but neatly combed back. He wore a clean, professional white coat, but there was something off about the way he moved. His footsteps were light, almost too light for someone his age, as though he was drifting rather than walking. But what truly unsettled Dr. Porter was the fact that he didn't recognize the man. He had spent enough time around St. Barnabas to know the faces of the staff, both new and old. Yet, this man was unfamiliar. He had never seen him before, not during orientation, not during any of the hospital's daily meetings, and certainly not among the doctors he worked with. Despite the oddity of his presence, no one else seemed to be bothered by the man. Nurses would smile warmly at him, doctors would nod in his direction, and patients never seemed to question his role. Everyone spoke highly of him, often referring to him as Dr. James. To Dr. Porter, it was strange. He had never heard of a Dr. James, yet every time the staff spoke of him, they spoke with reverence and respect, as though he were a long-standing member of the hospital team. Dr. James helped me with that procedure last night. Nurse Matthews remarked one morning as Dr. Porter passed by the nurse's station. He's been around for decades, and he always knows exactly what needs to be done. The comment stuck with Dr. Porter. Decades, he thought to himself. If the man had been working at St. Barnabas for so long, how had he never seen him before? Dr. Porter knew the staff roster by heart, as any good doctor should. He had reviewed the list of doctors, nurses, and medical personnel during his initial training, and there had never been a Dr. James. It didn't make sense. The more he thought about it, the more questions arose. Why had no one mentioned him before? Why didn't anyone seem surprised by his strange behavior, his tendency to appear and disappear without explanation? Dr. Porter couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. He decided to investigate further, hoping to find an explanation that would ease his growing anxiety. The first step was simple enough. He checked the hospital's staff directory. Surely there would be a record of Dr. James, even if he was an older, less active member of the team. But when he searched for the name in the hospital's database, there was nothing. No Dr. James listed anywhere, past or present. Confused, he tried looking through previous hospital records, archives from years past that might shed some light on the elusive doctor. Yet there was nothing. The name Dr. James was completely absent from the hospital's history. Dr. Porter's suspicion grew with each passing day. He started paying closer attention to the man's movements, watching him carefully during late-night shifts. Dr. James seemed to move in and out of rooms with an uncanny precision, always in the right place at the right time. He appeared to know exactly what needed to be done, offering his help without ever being asked. The staff seemed grateful, almost as if they expected him to be there. But Dr. Porter could feel a chill in the air whenever he was around. The man's presence wasn't just strange, it felt wrong. One evening, While Dr. Porter was reviewing some case files in the hospital's library, he found himself once again thinking about Dr. James. Unable to let go of his growing discomfort, he decided to dig a little deeper into the hospital's history, searching for any clue that might explain the enigma. That's when he stumbled upon a dusty old file buried in the back of a filing cabinet. It was a case file from 30 years ago. The file was worn, its edges frayed with age. But as Dr. Porter flipped through the pages, one photo caught his eye. A black and white photograph of a man in a white coat, standing proudly with a group of hospital staff. The man in the photo was unmistakably Dr. James. His face was younger, of course, but it was the same man. The same kind eyes, the same gentle expression. But as Dr. Porter examined the file more closely, a sense of dread washed over him. The caption beneath the photograph read, Dr. James, deceased, 1985. The file detailed the death of Dr. James, a highly respected physician who had worked at St. Barnabas for decades. According to the records, Dr. James had died unexpectedly in 1985 under mysterious circumstances. Some reports suggested a heart attack, others whispered about a tragic accident, but no one ever seemed to know for sure. What was clear, however, was that Dr. James had passed away nearly 30 years ago. The revelation hit Dr. Porter like a punch to the gut. The figure he had been seeing wasn't just a strange anomaly, it was impossible. Dr. James was dead. Yet, here he was, walking the halls of St. Barnabas, helping with tasks, offering guidance, and receiving the admiration of the staff as if he were still alive. Panic began to set in as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Was he seeing a ghost? Was he hallucinating? The line between the living and the dead seemed to blur in this place, a hospital rife with old memories and unresolved pasts. But there was no mistaking it now. He had seen the man, he had spoken to him, and now he knew the truth. Dr. Porter's thoughts raced as he struggled to process what he had discovered. The hospital, with its dark history and haunted past, had already shown him that not all ghosts were content to fade away. Was Dr. James one of those spirits? A lingering presence bound to the hospital by unfinished business, or perhaps a soul trapped by its own sense of duty. As the days wore on, Dr. Porter's anxiety deepened. He couldn't ignore the ghostly doctor anymore. He began to wonder if the man had been trying to tell him something all along, something important. But what could a ghost want from him? Was Dr. James reaching out for help? Or was there something darker at play? Every time Dr. Porter encountered Dr. James, the figure would act like nothing was out of the ordinary, offering assistance with tasks as though he were still alive. But the chill that ran through Dr. Porter's bones each time they crossed paths told him otherwise. Something was terribly wrong, and he could feel the weight of the hospital's eerie past pressing down on him, threatening to swallow him whole. Dr. Porter knew that he had to confront the truth, to face whatever was behind the haunting appearance of Dr. James. But as the days passed and the hospital's mysteries deepened, he found himself questioning his own reality. Was he losing his grip on sanity, or was something much darker at work in the shadowy halls of St. Barnabas? The answers, it seemed, were hidden just beyond his reach, buried in the very walls of the hospital itself. The hospital felt different now, heavier somehow. Dr. Porter could no longer shake the feeling that something was watching him, waiting. For days, he had wrestled with the truth he had uncovered. The man he had seen walking the halls of St. Barnabas wasn't just a figment of his imagination. He wasn't a kindly, forgotten doctor coming back to help. He was Dr. James, a man who had died nearly 30 years ago, and yet had not truly left. Dr. Porter had seen him everywhere, in the operating rooms, in the hallways at the nurse's station. But the more he reflected on his strange, almost ghostly presence, the more it became clear. Dr. James was not just a benevolent spirit. There was something darker beneath the surface. He had to confront the ghost. One late night, when the hospital was quiet except for the low hum of fluorescent lights and the distant murmur of machinery, Dr. Porter resolved to find Dr. James and demand the truth. He could no longer ignore the apparition, and he needed answers. Answers that would make sense of the mystery of the man who had never existed in the hospital's official records. He found him, as expected, in the dimly lit hallway near the old surgical wing. Dr. James stood silently, his figure casting a long shadow across the floor, his white coat almost glowing in the weak light. He looked so real, so tangible, but Dr. Porter knew better now. He wasn't real, not in the way that mattered. Dr. James, Dr. Porter said, his voice steady but laced with uncertainty. I need to know who you really are. The ghostly doctor turned slowly, as if surprised by the question. His face, though still kind and familiar, seemed distant, almost unreadable. His eyes, dark and haunted, met Dr. Porter's, and for the first time, Dr. Porter saw something other than kindness in them. A flicker of guilt, of anguish, that seemed to weigh the very air down. You know who I am, Dr. James said softly, his voice low and echoing slightly, as if coming from a great distance. You've already uncovered the truth. Dr. Porter swallowed, his heart pounding. I know you're dead, he said, his voice rising slightly. But why are you here? What unfinished business keeps you in this place? You're not helping anyone, Dr. James. You're haunting this hospital, and you're not allowing anyone to move on. Dr. James stared at him for a moment, his face twisting into a sad, almost resigned expression. Then, the weight of years of guilt seemed to break through his carefully maintained calm. His shoulders slumped, and the faintest tremor ran through his hands. I was a surgeon, Dr. James began, his voice quivering now. I made mistakes, big ones, too many to count. His voice cracked with the weight of the words. I thought I was helping people. I saved lives, but I also took them, unknowingly. It was my negligence that led to those deaths, and I didn't realize it, not until it was too late. I never got the chance to atone for what I did. So I stayed here. I stayed in this hospital because I couldn't forgive myself. The silence between them hung heavily as Dr. James looked down at the floor, seemingly lost in the memories of his past. Dr. Porter felt a chill wash over him as he realized the depth of the doctor's torment. The man wasn't here because he was a ghost wandering the halls by accident. He was here because he was still carrying the weight of his actions, a weight that had kept him tethered to the hospital long after his death. How many? Dr. Porter asked, his voice barely above a whisper. How many patients did you kill because of your mistakes? Dr. James hesitated, his expression pained. Too many to count. I thought I was doing the right thing. I was proud of my work, but I ignored the small signs, the symptoms that should have told me something was wrong. And I pushed my patients too far, convinced that I could save them all, even when I knew deep down I was failing them. The room seemed to darken as Dr. James spoke, the air thick with the suffocating sense of guilt that clung to him like a second skin. Dr. Porter's mind raced, the pieces of the mystery falling into place. This wasn't just the ghost of a doctor who had died tragically. It was the spirit of someone who had never come to terms with the harm he had caused. Someone who was so deeply burdened by his sins that he couldn't move on. Dr. Porter took a deep breath, his own heart pounding. This was the moment he had feared. The moment he would have to face not only the ghost of Dr. James, but the darkness that had kept him here all these years. You have to let go, Dr. Porter said gently but firmly. You can't change the past, but you can give these people peace. You owe them that. Dr. James' eyes flickered with a mix of disbelief and desperation. I can't. I don't deserve peace. I failed them, and now they. His voice broke, and the figure began to tremble, as though the very essence of his being was unraveling. Dr. James, Dr. Porter said, stepping closer, you have to forgive yourself. They've already forgiven you. You can't carry this burden forever. You have to move on. As Dr. Porter spoke, the temperature in the hallway dropped, and the figure of Dr. James began to distort. His form twisted and warped, as if the weight of his guilt was too much for his ethereal body to bear. His face became gaunt, his skin stretched tightly over his skull, and the once soft glow of his white coat turned to a sickly, decayed yellow. His eyes, once kind, now glowed with an unnatural light, filled with agony and regret. Dr. Porter stumbled back, his stomach turning as he watched the apparition unravel. The air grew thick with the stench of decay, and the very walls of the hospital seemed to pulse with the ghost's pain. The figure of Dr. James now appeared as a horrifying, anguished corpse, an embodiment of the man's deepest, most unresolved guilt. With a final, agonizing cry, the ghost of Dr. James collapsed to the ground, his form disintegrating into a cloud of dark mist that seemed to vanish into the hospital's walls. The weight that had pressed down on the hospital seemed to lift, and the oppressive air that had hung around Dr. Porter began to dissipate. For a moment, everything was still. The hallways were quiet once again, the only sound the distant murmur of machinery. Dr. Porter stood alone, shaken to his core by what had just transpired. The spirit of Dr. James was gone, finally released from the chains of his own guilt. But even as the apparition faded into nothingness, Dr. Porter couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed within him. The encounter had been more than just a confrontation with a ghost. It had been a stark reminder of the darkness that could linger in the hearts of those who had never faced the consequences of their actions. It had reminded him that no matter how much time passed, the weight of guilt could never truly be escaped until it was confronted and forgiven. As Dr. Porter left the hallway, he looked back one last time at the place where the ghost had vanished. The hospital was quieter now, the air lighter, but the memory of the ghostly encounter would remain with him forever. Dr. James had found peace at last, but for Dr. Porter, the haunting would linger in his mind, a reminder of the human cost of neglect and the healing power of forgiveness. Story 3. Hospital Ghost Hunters Stories. The dimly lit halls of St. Barnabas Hospital had long been the subject of rumors. Whispers of eerie occurrences and ghostly apparitions had circulated for years, but it wasn't until recent events, strange sightings, unexplained screams, and chilling encounters, that the hospital had gained a reputation for being one of the most haunted places in the region. A particular group of paranormal investigators, known for their ability to uncover even the most elusive of spirits, had taken an interest in the place. They had heard the stories and, intrigued by the growing rumors, decided to embark on a full-scale investigation to uncover the truth behind the hauntings. The team arrived one cold autumn evening, the air thick with anticipation. Dr. Porter, already a bit worn from his own recent supernatural experiences, reluctantly agreed to let them investigate, his curiosity getting the better of him. The investigators, 2 men and 2 women, each experienced in their own ways, set up their equipment throughout the hospital. Cameras were positioned in dark corners of the abandoned wings. Motion detectors were placed near the most active areas, and voice recorders were set to capture any whispers or murmurs that might reveal themselves in the silence. "All right, team," said Adam, the lead investigator, as he clapped his hands together. "We got a long night ahead of us. Let's get to work." His words hung in the air as the team scattered to their designated locations. Dr. Porter watched them with a mix of intrigue and skepticism. He had seen strange things happen here, but a professional investigation was a different matter entirely. The first few hours were uneventful, with only a few strange noises. Creaking doors, the hum of old pipes, and the occasional distant thump that could have been anything. But as midnight approached, the atmosphere in the hospital seemed to shift. The air grew colder, and the silence deepened, almost suffocating in its intensity. Suddenly, the cameras captured something that made everyone freeze. In one of the hospital's old hallways, a shadowy figure appeared in front of one of the team's cameras, its form barely discernible in the flickering light. It wasn't the figure of a person but something else, an almost translucent shape that moved unnaturally, as though it was both there and not there at the same time. The footage was blurry and distorted, but the movement was unmistakable. "Did you see that?" Maria, one of the investigators, whispered, her voice trembling slightly. There was definitely something. Adam frowned as he rewound the footage. The others gathered around, staring at the screen as the figure drifted into view once again. "That's not a person," Adam said, his voice low. "It's something else. Something not alive." But it wasn't just the video footage that had captured the investigators' attention. As they moved through the darkened hospital, more disturbing events began to unfold. Flickering lights, strange sounds, footsteps that couldn't be explained, and doors that opened and closed on their own. The investigators began to piece together a chilling narrative as they dug deeper into the hospital's past. Late into the night, They sat together in the staff lounge, surrounded by old hospital records and files they had gathered. Adam leafed through a pile of papers, his expression grim. The room was deathly quiet, except for the faint buzzing of the old fluorescent lights overhead. "The more we dig, the more we find," Adam said softly, his eyes scanning the documents. "There's a long history of death in this place, not just from illness, but from neglect and worse." As he spoke, he read aloud from a patient file. John M. Thomas, male, age 45, admitted in 1967 for minor surgery. Cause of death: undetermined, complications from unreported infection. The name didn't sound familiar, but as they continued to read through other records, it became clear that something sinister had happened at St. Barnabas long before it became a place of legend. Dozens of patients had died under mysterious circumstances, many from neglect, some from infections that spread unchecked due to improper care, and others due to accidents during surgeries that had been poorly executed. Some had died screaming in the night, alone and forgotten. Maria, who had been quiet until now, glanced at the others. It's like the hospital itself is haunted by the weight of all these untold deaths. These spirits never got the closure they needed. They all fell silent as the gravity of the situation sank in. The restless spirits that walked the halls of St. Barnabas weren't just the usual hauntings. They were souls trapped by unfinished business, victims of a system that had failed them, leaving them to suffer and die in pain. As the team prepared to continue their investigation, things took a darker turn. The first sign of serious trouble came when one of the team members, Tom, was walking alone down a hallway when he suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. His face went pale, and he froze in place. "Tom, what is it?" Adam called out, rushing to his side. I felt it," Tom stammered, his voice shaky. Something grabbed me. Cold, like ice. It was like a hand on my shoulder, but there was nothing there." The group gathered around him, and his eyes were wide with fear. The others tried to calm him down, but he couldn't shake the terror from his voice. "It was so cold," Tom muttered. "I don't think it was just a ghost. This wasn't a spirit. It felt like something alive." As the night wore on, the team became more desperate. The strange occurrences grew more aggressive. Flickering lights that wouldn't turn off, shadowy figures moving in the corners of their eyes, and eerie whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. By the time they reached the hospital's old surgery wing, the investigators were clearly rattled. The darkness here felt deeper, more oppressive, like something was watching them, waiting. Then it happened. As they set up their cameras in the darkened operating room, a loud crash echoed through the space. The lights flickered violently, casting the room into alternating moments of light and complete darkness. The air grew thick, heavy with an unexplainable tension, as if the very walls of the room were closing in on them. "What was that?" Maria shouted, her voice shaking as she scanned the room. But the question went unanswered. Something moved in the corner of the room. Something fast, something unseen. It was as if an invisible entity was darting in and out of the shadows, its presence undeniable but ungraspable. Suddenly, the voice recorder, which had been silent until now, crackled to life. A low, guttural voice whispered, almost imperceptibly, "Help me, help me." Maria gasped. "Did you hear that? Someone's here, someone's still here." The voice continued, growing more urgent, its words clearer. "I didn't deserve to die. Help me." A cold chill washed over the group, the air growing colder by the second. Tom, who had been visibly shaken earlier, began to back away, his eyes wide with terror. "We have to leave. Now," he muttered, his face ashen. But it was too late. The shadowy figures in the corner of the room started to grow, coalescing into shapes, horrifying forms that seemed to reach out for them. One of them lunged forward, an invisible force slamming into Adam and knocking him to the floor. The others screamed as the temperature in the room plummeted, and everything seemed to spin into chaos. The investigators barely managed to make it out of the room, breathless and terrified. They knew they had uncovered something much darker than they had anticipated, something that went beyond mere spirits of the dead. These weren't just souls lost in the afterlife. These were tormented beings, their anguish bound to the hospital, seeking release from the cruel fate that had befallen them. As they hurried out of the hospital, hearts racing, they knew that they had uncovered more than they had bargained for. The truth was more terrifying than any of them had imagined, and the hospital's dark history, steeped in neglect and tragedy, would continue to haunt them long after they had left. The night had descended into chaos, a nightmarish web of paranormal activity that no one could have anticipated. The air was thick with the weight of unseen forces. As the group of ghost hunters scrambled through the abandoned corridors of St. Barnabas Hospital, desperate to uncover the truth behind the terrifying hauntings that plagued the hospital. The temperature had dropped significantly, the cold creeping into their bones, and the silence between the disturbing noises that seemed to echo through the hallways was deafening. Shadows lurked in every corner, whispering, lurking, always just out of reach. What started as a professional investigation had quickly turned into a terrifying fight for survival. Adam, Maria, Tom, and the rest of the team had felt something change in the air as they delved deeper into the hospital's history. The paranormal activity had grown more violent, more desperate, and more personal. But it wasn't until they reached the hospital's old records room that the truth began to unfold. An unsettling, unexpected truth that no one could have prepared for. As the team pored over the hospital's patient logs and old medical records, something caught Maria's attention. One name, among all the others, stood out, a name that seemed too familiar. The name was Emily Harper, a former patient who had died in a botched surgical procedure. The record showed that she had been a young woman, once vibrant and full of life, but her death had been ruled as a tragic accident, a result of medical negligence that had gone unpunished. What was more unsettling was the fact that her file was strangely well documented, almost too perfectly preserved. Maria felt a chill creep up her spine as she realized something. Emily Harper's name had been mentioned in passing by the ghost hunters during their investigation. Adam had even referred to her once, as if he knew her personally. Yet, none of them had thought to ask why he was so familiar with the name. It was a fleeting thought, but as Maria turned to him, the realization hit her like a freight train. You knew about Emily, didn't you? She asked, her voice trembling with unease. Adam's eyes flickered with something strange, something that didn't belong in the eyes of a man who had spent his life hunting ghosts. For a moment, his face went pale and his posture stiffened. "What are you talking about?" he stammered, trying to deflect the question. But Maria wasn't buying it. She stepped closer to him, the weight of the truth pressing down on her chest. "You were the one who brought up Emily's name earlier. You said she was just another lost soul. But you've been in this hospital before. Haven't you, Adam?" The tension in the room escalated. The rest of the team looked at Adam, confusion and suspicion clouding their faces. Tom, whose nerves had been frayed all night, began to back away, but Adam's gaze fixed on him, almost as if trying to calm him. "No," Adam said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't understand. I didn't want you to find out." Before anyone could react, the shadows in the room seemed to shift, curling around them like tendrils of darkness. The temperature dropped even further, and the lights flickered erratically. A cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing the candles they had lit, and suddenly, the oppressive silence was shattered by a voice. Not Adam's, but a voice that echoed throughout the room. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice rasped, low and guttural. The words reverberated off the walls, sending a wave of terror through the group. The team froze in shock as they realized that Adam was no longer the person they thought he was. The truth came crashing down. Adam wasn't just a paranormal investigator. He was a former patient of St. Barnabas Hospital. His true name was Daniel Ward, and he had been the victim of a botched surgical procedure many years ago. After his death, his spirit had become trapped in the hospital, left to wander the halls as a ghost. He had been using the ghost hunting team as pawns in his twisted game, manipulating them to trap their souls in the same spiritual web that had ensnared him. Maria's heart pounded in her chest as the horrifying realization sunk in. She looked at Adam, or rather Daniel, and saw the truth in his eyes. He had been the one behind all the hauntings, the one who had been orchestrating everything from the shadows. He was not just a victim of the hospital. He had become a malevolent force, using the power of the ghosts that lingered within the walls to trap others and feed off their fear. "You're Emily," Maria whispered, her voice cracking. "You've been manipulating us all, using us to keep the hospital's spirits trapped." Daniel's lips curled into a twisted grin. "You don't understand. I was once like you, alive, full of potential. But I was betrayed by this hospital, by the very people who were supposed to save me. Now I'll make sure they never leave. No one ever leaves." The team stood in stunned silence, their minds reeling as they tried to process what they had just learned. But before anyone could react, the air around them grew heavy. The hospital seemed to shift, the walls themselves vibrating with an unseen force. A low, rumbling sound echoed through the halls, growing louder with every passing second. It was then that the true horror began. The lights flickered once more, and the shadows in the room seemed to come alive. Figures emerged from the darkness, former patients, doctors, and staff members who had perished within the hospital's walls. But these weren't the same spirits they had encountered before. These were twisted, vengeful apparitions, their faces contorted in pain and rage, their bodies decayed and barely recognizable. They were under Daniel's control, their spirits bound to his will. With a scream, Maria turned to the others. "We have to get out, now!" But it was too late. Daniel, or whatever he had become, reached out with a skeletal hand, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The room seemed to close in on them, and the team was trapped in the grip of the hospital's malevolent forces. In a final, desperate attempt to escape, Tom grabbed a nearby chair and hurled it at Daniel, but it passed through him as though he were made of smoke. The ghost hunter's face twisted in pain as the spirits around him began to close in. For a moment, it seemed as though the darkness itself was suffocating them. But then, as if something snapped within Daniel, his form began to disintegrate before their eyes. The spirits he had controlled faltered, their hold weakening. "We can't fight him directly," Maria said, her voice filled with desperation. "We need to sever his connection to the hospital. We need to break the chain." The team quickly acted, using the tools they had brought: special salt, ceremonial objects, and ancient incantations they had studied. As they chanted the words, the spirits of the hospital began to scream, their wails reverberating through the walls. Daniel's form flickered, his body twisting and writhing in agony as the chain between him and the hospital began to unravel. With one final, horrific scream, Daniel collapsed into a cloud of darkness, and the room fell silent. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the spirits that had been trapped in the hospital began to dissipate, their forms dissolving into nothingness. The team stood in stunned silence, the reality of what had just happened slowly sinking in. They had survived, but at a great cost. The hospital was no longer haunted, but the scars of that night would remain with them forever. As Dr. Porter arrived, drawn by the chaos, he could only stand in silence, witnessing the aftermath. The darkness had lifted, but the hospital's history, the lives lost, the betrayals, and the lingering spirits would never be erased. The ghost hunters had uncovered the truth, but in doing so, they had uncovered something far more terrifying than they had ever imagined. And now, they would have to live with the consequences of their actions, knowing that the past could never truly be left behind. Dr. Porter sat in the dimly lit office, the faint glow of a single desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. The hospital, now eerily quiet after the chaos that had unfolded over the past few days, seemed to breathe around him. He could feel the weight of its history pressing in from all sides, like an invisible force, never truly letting go. The stories he had uncovered, each more horrifying and tragic than the last, swirled in his mind, their significance growing clearer with each passing moment. He thought of the first haunting, the ghost of Dr. James, whose regret and guilt had bound him to the hospital. The man had never left, trapped by the consequences of his actions, unable to reconcile with the patients whose lives he had destroyed. Then there was the story of the ghost hunters, their own encounter with darkness, which had revealed the twisted nature of the hospital's past. And finally, the apparition of Emily Harper. Her suffering, her anger, and her desire for revenge had all been manipulated by someone who had never been allowed to die in peace. Each of these stories, Dr. Porter realized, was a manifestation of something much deeper than a mere haunting. They were all a reflection of guilt, of unresolved trauma that had festered and grown, just as the hospital had grown over the years. The ghosts that haunted these halls were not merely spirits seeking vengeance. They were the echoes of people who had lived and died without coming to terms with the consequences of their actions. They were prisoners of their own guilt, unable to escape their pasts. Dr. Porter ran a hand over his face, the weight of the truth sinking in. As much as he had tried to rationalize the hauntings, to dismiss them as the product of superstition or madness, he knew now that the horrors of the hospital were real. Not just because of the spirits that roamed the halls, but because of the lives that had been affected, ruined, and lost within these walls. The hospital itself, in many ways, had become a mirror to the darkness within its patients and staff. Looking out the window into the night, Dr. Porter let out a long breath. His thoughts drifted back to the night of the investigation, to the chilling realization that the hospital's haunting was not just supernatural. It was deeply human. The past, he had come to understand, had a way of clinging to people, places, and memories. The hospital, for all its sterile corridors and medical advancements, was nothing more than a vessel for the collective sins of those who had once walked its halls. Had the hospital ever truly been haunted by spirits? Or had the true horror been something more intangible, more insidious? Dr. Porter couldn't shake the feeling that the ghostly apparitions, the flickering lights, the strange noises, they were all manifestations of something far more troubling than a simple supernatural curse. They were the emotional and moral consequences of lives lived carelessly, of wrongdoings that had never been acknowledged, of choices that had gone unexamined. In the end, what had made the hospital so terrifying wasn't the presence of the dead, but the weight of what the living had left behind. Dr. Porter had thought of himself as someone who dealt in facts, someone who had been immune to the emotional toll of the hospital's past. But now, in the silence of the night, he realized how deeply the past had already affected him. It wasn't just the ghosts he had uncovered. It was the darkness within himself that he had been running from all along. The story of St. Barnabas Hospital was not just one of hauntings, but a story of unresolved guilt, of things left unsaid and undone. It was a story of people who had been consumed by their pasts, by the things they had chosen to ignore or bury. The ghosts that wandered the halls of the hospital were not merely spectral figures, but the emotional and moral consequences of the actions taken, and the actions not taken. As Dr. Porter thought about his own role in the story, he understood that the hospital, like the people who had been a part of it, was haunted by its choices. Every decision made, every life affected, every mistake left uncorrected, it all accumulated, festering like an open wound that never healed. And as the years went by, those sins became more than just memories. They became forces that could not be escaped. The message was clear. The past never truly leaves us. It lingers, hidden in the shadows, until we are forced to face it. The ghosts of St. Barnabas Hospital had been trapped in time, unwilling or unable to move on because they had never confronted the consequences of their actions. The same, Dr. Porter realized, could be said for the living. We all carry the weight of our choices, our regrets, and our sins. If we choose to ignore them, to bury them in the dark corners of our minds, they may return to haunt us in ways we can't control. The hospital's dark history was not just a relic of the past. It was alive, still influencing the present, still shaping the future. The ghosts that had haunted St. Barnabas were not just spirits. They were reminders of the emotional and moral consequences that no one could outrun. And, in the end, they were a warning that if we refuse to confront our pasts, we will become its prisoners, just as the hospital had become the prison for those who could never escape their guilt. Dr. Porter sat back in his chair, the weight of the stories and the lessons they carried pressing heavily on his chest. As much as he had learned, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to uncover, more to understand. But for now, The hospital had given him its final lesson, that the past, no matter how deeply buried, would always find a way to resurface. And when it did, it would be more terrifying than anything a ghost could ever be.